Hi everyone, welcome. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging the first Australians, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands we meet on tonight. I'd like to say that sovereignty was never ceded, and we are living and working on their lands and seas and sky. My name is Eugenia Lim, and I'm an artist and the founding editor of HASSELL Papers. Tonight's talk is one of the last in a series of talks, public program associated with the show, The Australian Ugliness, which is upstairs at the Dulux Gallery, and it's running till the 25th of August, and please check it out if you haven't yet. Like the process of architecture itself, the project has been the culmination of about 2.5 years of work and a long list of collaborators and supporters and partners. And I'd like to especially thank Open House Melbourne, Melbourne School of Design and HASSELL for tonight's talk. As you can see with the AV kind of backing and forthing, we're doing some recording tonight. So just bear that in mind. And we'll have roughly 45 minutes for discussion with the panel and then some time for questions afterwards as well. So get your thinking caps on. So before we start, I just want to set the scene a little bit for tonight's conversation. Central to my version of The Australian Ugliness, which is the exhibition upstairs, is an exploration of contemporary Australia. So where do women and people of colour, fluid genders fit into the built environment of Australia? To quote Camilla Block, principal of Durback Block Jaggers, "Architecture is a shared and learnt language, but apart from Lena Bobardi, all my architectural loves are men. Women have largely been forgotten or left out of architectural history, which means that the way we design, build and understand our world is still within an overwhelmingly masculine framework. How do we move towards a more open and plural practice? How do we move towards," and I quote Camilla Block again because I find it poetic and powerful, "a new androgynous bedrock for architecture that sees all people as equal?" The 2017 World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report has Australia at number 35 out of a total 144 countries mapped on the global gender disparity map, below Mozambique and Lithuania, with Iceland at number 1. The map measures economic participation, education, health, and political empowerment between men and women, and states that gender parity is fundamental to whether and how economies and societies thrive. Ensuring the full development and appropriate deployment of half of the world's total talent pool has a vast bearing on the growth, competitiveness, and future readiness of economies and businesses worldwide. So tonight, we're looking at gender equity in relation to the built environment. With the 2013 establishment of the Australian Institute of Architects Gender Equity Policy, and through the continued work and advocacy of Parlour, the architecture and design industry has a clear voice on gender equality and balance. But is it still a man's world? Are thinkers and practitioners on the built environment walking the talk? And as we try and shift away from binary definitions of gender, race and identity, how do we ensure that these important perspectives are included in our push for greater equity, so that the way the world is designed, built and understood might actually one day reflect the diversity of those living in it? So to help us navigate this hugely important topic, we've got an esteemed panel to my right, and I will introduce them now one by one, and then we'll kick off the conversation. So directly to my right, I have Ingrid Bakker, who's the Broad Director and Principal of HASSELL and part of the regional leadership team overseeing the Australian region. She's a registered architect with over 20 years' experience of both architectural and interior design industries. She's led teams on a large variety of workplace, residential, hospitality, retail and commercial projects. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thank you.
And then sitting next to Ingrid is Nicole Kalms. Nicole is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture and founding director of the XYX Lab at Monash Uni. Nicole has a PhD in architecture from Monash Uni as well. She's recently published the monograph Hypersexual City through Routledge in 2017, which examines sexualised representation and precincts in neoliberal cities, and she regularly writes for a diverse, non-academic audience and is a frequent speaker on sexuality and urban space at major national and international cultural institutions. Welcome, Nicole. And next to Nicole is Justine Clark, an architectural editor, writer, researcher and critic. She's the co-founder of Parlour, Women, Equity, Architecture, and she's also the editor of the Parlour website. Justine is a former editor of Architecture Australia and remains active in public discourse on architecture and is a consultant and speaker on the built environment. She's won awards for architecture in the media, including, come on, own it, and the 2015 Marion Mahoney Prize. Her writing appears in both scholarly and professional press on topics including gender and architecture, architectural criticism, architectural drawing, and post-war modernism. Welcome, Justine. And last but not least, Cameron Bruhn has been the editorial director at Architecture Media for 9 years and apparently is now moving on to become the Dean of Architecture at the Uni of Queensland. So congrats, Cameron. But for the next maybe month or two, he will continue at the helm of Architecture Australia, Houses Magazine, Artichoke, amongst others, as well as working on the online design news site Architecture AU. He holds a PhD in Architecture and Design and is currently Adjunct Associate Professor at the Uni of Queensland. Welcome, Cameron. Give him a round of applause, guys. Okay, so I'll fire off a few questions, but I'm hoping we can kind of have more of a convo, I think. But maybe I'll start with you, Ingrid. I wanted to kind of, I guess, know more about gender equity within the practice, because you are a global company, so you have, I think, is it maybe 14 offices? 10. Yeah. Big anyway. And there's a sense that I guess there is a kind of collective vision. There's not a singular architect. And I wanted to know about that kind of decision to be, I guess, a collective practice. Is that something that has evolved recently, or because you're an 80-year-old practice?
So yeah, we are an 80-year-old practice. I think the practice has always had that element of collaboration and collective voice rather than one singular named architect. Yes, there was a Mr. HASSELL back in the day, but he worked very collaboratively, not only in architecture but also across other disciplines. So that's always been, I think, one of the strengths of the practice, that it's not just one discipline and it's not just one voice, it's a multitude of voices. So that's something that we've been consciously, I suppose, trying to then grow and develop over a long period of time. And I suppose the last 10 to 15 years is what I'm more knowledgeable about, because that's how long I've been in the practice. And it's always been about, a multitude of voices, both young and old, male and female, diverse cultures. We've encouraged employing people from all sorts of cultures within the practice all over the world. And we're keen to get that diversity. But then you look at the numbers, and although our overall population is very close to 50-50, it's something like 49-51, when you start to look at the seniority, the levels of seniority at graduate level, student level, it's all very even. And then there's this kind of magical time around when people are somewhere in their 30s where we just get this cliff. And so the numbers that we have in the leadership are not 50-50 that we would like them to be. So it's a conscious decision that the board is now really focusing on, and so part of that was to look at some practical things we could do, not just want it to happen, because I think there's no lack of want within the practice for it to happen, but how can you actually make it happen? Yeah. So you have to actually do some things. So we've started to implement some really practical, really basic sounds. Some of them sound really simple, around making sure that every submission we do has a balanced team. Every pitch that we do to clients has a balanced team. When we present to each of the studios, just internal presentations, that we're balancing the voice of who's presenting, not just gender, but also age and experience and nationality and all of that sort of thing. So we've got a whole series of these initiatives. So there's some training involved. There's some, I suppose more about also the work that we do with our clients. So if we're inviting clients to an event, we'll try and make sure that there's a balanced table, or that our guest list is balanced. So there's a whole consciousness about it that we may have been doing anyway in some regards, but not everybody was doing that. So now there's a consciousness, and now permission for anyone to call out when that behaviour is not happening as well. So that's been a shift, I suppose, just recently, that consciousness about it.
Justine, you've done a lot of research on this particular topic. This, I guess, this idea that there's a marked drop-off when we get to kind of senior management and leadership levels within architecture for women. Maybe could you talk us through, because there's been, I guess, Parlour, which sort of grew out of research, an ARC grant, and then that has led to, I guess, the AIA gender equity policy as well. So I'm interested, maybe if you could talk us through some of your findings, and also whether much has shifted in those last 5 years since that policy for the AIA came out.
Okay, so in fact, our colleague Jill Mathewson did a vast amount of the statistical analysis that really is at the base of almost everything we do. And it was the first time there'd been any kind of comprehensive map of women's participation in the profession, and what she found, I think, shocked everybody. And it's been extraordinarily helpful, both in terms of understanding the issues, but also really in terms of making them very apparent. So you can't, when people go, oh no, there's not really a problem, which people don't do now, but they did. The numbers, that drop after 30, we've got this fantastic chart that just shows women disappearing from the profession. I mean, it's not fantastic, but it is fantastic. Women disappearing from the profession in every measure, as educators, as members of the institute, as census, whatever you look at. And none of these are very reliable, but looking at them together, the picture is, continuously the same. So that's been, women are much more likely to be employees than employers. Women, there are twice as many women active in the profession as there are registered architects. There are also quite a lot of men active who aren't registered, but like 1/3. So again, women form a much bigger part of the informal workforce. Whatever measure you look at, women are underrepresented, and it's not just a pipeline issue. Women have been graduating between 40 and 50% for 25 years. So, when I graduated, it felt like it was 50-50. It might not have been, but it certainly felt that way. And so I think we can't just wait. We have to kind of make these very active and considered decisions. And I think, we need people in practice doing exactly what Ingrid's doing. We need people writing women into Wikipedia. We need the kind of work Nikki's doing. We really need lots and lots of different tactics. We need people operating in, the kind of expanded field of architecture. We need women who are people trained in architecture going into as client reps. Blah. There's just lots and lots and lots. There's no one problem, there's no one solution. Jill has recently done an analysis of the most recent census data, which we are about to publish, which shows some improvement. There are the 6% increase in the number of the proportion of women who are registered as and not registered against the census has increased by 6% from 51 to 57. So it's a small but relatively significant increase. Women seem to be more likely to be owners of practices than they were in 2011. So there's some small increases which are good, but overall, if we just wait for those incremental changes, it's not going to be enough. So, there's a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of work being done, and there's a lot of people doing that work, and I think that's what's really changed. Since the research began and since Parlour was launched. It's not that people weren't doing stuff in their own lives, but there was no public discussion, and there was no kind of sharing of knowledge or research or tactics or strategies, and there was, practices weren't publicly saying we're doing this. So things have shifted a lot, but it's not something that's going to change quickly. But the other thing I think I'd say is we've also seen a lot more women standing up and taking on roles. I mean, there are so many women leading architecture schools in the country. There are many women president of various chapters of the Institute. And I do feel like that kind of public discourse has encouraged people to go, okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and step up. So, a young woman too.
Is it something about, I guess, the idea that maybe the audience is really widened as well? It's not just these kind of like women in architecture panels just for a female audience, but it's something whereby, it is a public discourse now and it involves everybody. Cameron, I'll bring you in here. I wanted to, I guess, talk about the way that we write and I guess we reflect architecture. I suppose there's still this sense in architecture that, we touched on the Starchitect before, that there's still a kind of culture of awards and prizes and a kind of singular vision. And I wonder, as someone so kind of enmeshed in architectural media, how do you kind of respond to that, or how do you kind of expand the way that we understand the built environment?
I'm going to borrow from both Justine and Ingrid because I think Ingrid's kind of catchphrase, which is you've got to do more than you just want to do it or imagine it's going to happen. And Parlour's taught us a huge amount about that, is that you can't just want it to happen, you've got to do something. And in parallel, I think over the 5 years since Parlour, the reverse of what Justine's saying about more women putting themselves forward, in parallel, I think we've observed more men preparing to step back to allow a woman to step forward. And I think that's a very significant change in a number of practices around the country. So the other thing that I think is really interesting, and Justine's talked about the kind of informal architectural census or the informal architectural population. And I think my observation is a parallel issue is around the way in which architecture has tended to only value the contribution made by those people who've studied architecture, proceeded through registration and continued to remain practicing as registered architects around their career. And I think that's a real, in parallel with the loss that architecture has faced as a result of not valuing the work of women and a whole range of other people. So I think there is... So I think there is an interesting conversation that is piggyback, will I think in the next few years piggyback on the work of Parlour, is to actually provide more identity within the profession of architecture for people who aren't registered, the sorts of people who are clients, who are doing all sorts of other things, project management. And we did a fantastic section in Architecture Australia last year, which was guest edited by Tanya Davidge and Christine Phillips, looking at what we called left of field, and which Rachel Hurst from UniSA kind of extended and said left out of the field, trying to find ways in which we could add something to the conversation that said, well, actually, someone like, say, Kate Langan, for example, who's head of property at ANZ, a very significant, like a powerful person in the property industry with an architecture degree, but has probably not thought of herself as an architect or as practicing architecture for 20 years. And I think the whole profession, the institute and the profession at large, actually is missing out by not including all those other interesting people in our tent and imagining that there is more than one path in terms of practicing architecture.
I'm so sick of saying, but you're not an architect. I was talking to the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner a while ago about various things, and she went, no, you don't need to explain that to me. I've got an architecture degree. And I went, no idea. She said, I use it every day. So I'm not even sure that people might not identify as practicing architects, but certainly many, many people operating in the kind of expanded field identify architecture as their discipline. And I absolutely and utterly agree with you that there's really narrow barriers for kind of participation and voice and all sorts of areas to do with the profession are incredibly unhelpful. And I've spent quite a lot of time, asking people, what's the future? What does the profession need to be doing to be kind of improving its lot? What's the future of the profession? Blah blah blah. The people who've got something to say about that mostly are the people on its edges. I find that people right in the middle of conventional practice go, oh, well, it should be like it used to be when we were in charge, which isn't really getting us anywhere. So I utterly agree.
I think you said before, Justine, that I guess the practice of architecture needs to turn design on itself, like in terms of, if it's a profession that synthesises so much about, I guess, the built environment, economics, social justice, can that not happen internally within itself? Nicole, I want to ask you about your work with XYX Lab and I guess this element of co-design where you work with LGBTI communities and young women and girls, but also, I guess, planners and policy wonks and a broader range as well. Can you talk about that work and I guess this idea of gendered space as well?
Yeah, well, the XYX Lab is an inherently interdisciplinary team. So we're architects, we're urban designers, we're communication designers and design researchers. And I guess the thing that's slightly different about the lab and its inception is that we were really asked to engage in real-world social issues specifically as a remit from our dean. So I had written a book and I imagined a future where I would just be writing book after book for the next 20 years of my academic life, and that really changed my kind of thinking about how this lab was going to kind of find itself. So I think that this has been contextualised by the work of Parlour, and the lab was able to find a way in academia because of that particular moment in time, and really what we discovered when we moved into that idea of social issues and thinking about this in the real world actually aligns with some of these things about the architect kind of coming down a few steps. And that is that we really needed to engage very directly with people in their own expertise. And so that co-design thing has been really about, particularly with young women and their experiences in cities, is actually seeing them as experts in their own experience, engaging them in a very particular way. And an unusual way in that we bring them into contact with architects, but also with stakeholders like urban designers and policymakers, and really make policymakers see the city through the eyes of young women. And we do a similar thing with LGBTI communities, with the Pride Centre, etc. So for us, that is a very clear kind of feminist framework that allows us to develop research out of that. Our main thing at the moment is surfacing these experiences and stories from women. So that then becomes a data set that we then use to advocate for women, but also in an activist way to kind of change policy. So that's kind of what the lab is doing.
Can you talk more about the Free to Be project as I guess a kind of case study of that?
So the Free to Be project is essentially a data collection tool. It's been set up by Plan International, but interestingly, we're just about to launch another similar project with the Department of Health and Human Services and the Victorian State Government. And it's crowdsourcing, so it's allowing people, everybody, to input their experiences of urban spaces. And we normally would see these, and it's essentially around safe and unsafe experiences. And for young women, those unsafe experiences are around sexual harassment and sexual assault. So what we would normally see is a police report that's about a postcode with no sense of nuance of where and how and why. So the data that we collect actually allows women to use a geolocative map to actually say it was here and this is exactly what happened, and they tell their story. This also combats the fact that most sexual assault and sexual harassment, like 80%, is never reported. And about 80% of young women are sexually harassed all the time, every week. So there's a lot of data to collect. But what we're really seeing is these hotspots in cities, and as architects and researchers, we go in and we look at those spaces and we see what might be happening. And one of the really interesting things that we're discovering is, of course, there are elements of the city, places in the city where this happens a lot, but there are also kind of systems, like public transport is a huge system and hotbed for sexual harassment. Particular spaces in Melbourne, we've just done Sydney. We've completed maps in Lima, Kampala, Delhi and Madrid. So this is like an international project where we're looking at the similar experiences that women have all around the world. And all women are affected by these things, especially young women.
So reading up a little bit about the project, I think there's some discussion about public transport, you know, I guess kind of like safety buttons and these sort of, I guess, quite generic stances on safety that don't perhaps take into account, you know, the fact that, it might be a young woman who kind of can't reach for those things until it's too late. I guess I'd like to hear more about, you know, I guess this idea of, gendered space, or maybe gender neutral versus gendered space, and how that plays out currently, and I guess what's happening you know, based on the data that you have to sort of shift that.
Well, what we know is that mostly there's very few gender policies around, particularly public transport, and indeed all of them tend to be around, as you say, after something has happened. So our work is about being on the kind of front foot of these kinds of incidents, and I think that this also, thinking about this idea of architects needing to change, the kind of true practitioner architect needing to change, is really thinking more broadly about what design does and what it is, and we really imagine ourselves as like the sticky things between all these different disciplines, so that people say, oh, but how are you going to resolve that with a design object? And it's not really about that. You know, we're trained in very diverse ways. So a lot of the stuff is around communication campaigns, or feelings of safety, perceptions of safety. The presence of other women makes women feel safe. So how do we kind of socially understand these interconnected forces, and how do we design for those things to happen, rather than kind of saying, oh, here's a thing, here's a button, here's a yellow striped square to stand in. You know, these, you know, it's not as simple as that. So we're really, you know, we work with criminologists, we work with urban policymakers, we're working with transport planners. There's lots of different people that kind of come into that picture to help solve those problems.
And Ingrid, what about you? At HASSELL, you call yourselves transdisciplinary rather than, I think, multidisciplinary. I'm guessing you work with a lot of different, a lot of different people within that. How are these kind of ideas about, you know, gender and equity influencing the design process within the workplace?
Yeah, I don't know that there has been a consciousness about that. When I talk about the consciousness before, I think because we've got that diversity, and the transdisciplinary is not just about architecture and interior design and landscape, it's also about experience designers, and we're working a lot with Free State, who we've merged with, who are all about experience. So that's about understanding the experience of all of the different people that are going to be using a space. So, you know, you could focus in on the experience of a young woman and how safe she feels as one exercise within that. But I don't know that we have actually, I think it's more about the diversity of our teams. We should be getting that perspective through, you know, I'm looking here in the front row at two of our fabulous rail architects working on the Metro project at the moment in collaboration. We've got Weston Williamson and HASSELL working together. And, you know, I'm fascinated to have a chat with them tomorrow about how we might be able to bring some of the work into the work that we're doing. And I know you've already been talking with Mina, so it's all connecting the dots, which is great. But it is, you know, it's a fascinating topic, I think, about, you know, it's about experience design. So understanding how people are going to use a space, what kind of experience are they going to have in that space, and then the design should be kind of reflecting those needs and those, you know, those concerns, or, you know, whatever they might be.
So I guess the moral of the story is multi-pronged approach. We're talking about, I guess, workplace culture and design, but I think also it's worth us talking about maybe history and I guess women within that history in terms of the built environment and design. This idea that, Camilla Block, her hero, her only female hero is Lina Barbardi. There aren't the same kind of names that we can reel off. And that's not because they don't exist. It's just that there hasn't been the same level of, kind of care or understanding. Perhaps we could talk about the WikiD project and some of the work that you do with that.
Okay, so WikiD is a program that's international. It's between us, a group in New York led by Laurie Bruhn and a group in Berlin. Wikipedia has a very well-known, clearly identified problem with gender in terms of who contributes, who writes, and the kinds of material that makes it through the barriers. There's also, though, a very clear understanding on their part that there is a problem. And so we got started when our friend Laurie in New York wrote going, we're going to change this, we need to write more women in. So we all got very excited and we sort of had an event and we had a go, and we were fairly mortified when all our great work was being taken down almost straight away, and at that time Wikimedia had a fund to apply for to help improve gender balance, so it's not as if it's not a known problem that they're trying to address. We got a grant and we set about, we had a whole lot of workshops to try and write people in, but what really worked is we figured out, it's not rocket science, that basically if we work within that system, we're much more likely to get things to stay up there. So there's lots of information out there to tell you how to write a Wikipedia article, but most of it to people like me is just impenetrable. So we wrote some guides. We've discovered we're quite good at guides and that really helps. Who knew? but I think what we're trying to do is put tools and resources and knowledge into the hands of as many people as possible so that we don't have to sit, we do sit there writing entries when we have got time, but that really it's a kind of about distributed responsibility, but giving people a hand. So yes, we're writing women in, but yes, there are women there, but the structures of the profession mean that there's not some fantastic star hero woman architect to be discovered. There is the role that women play in the making of the built environment as clients, as architects. Julia Willis, who's the dean of this faculty, has done more work on this than anyone, and points out that when you look for women, you also find a whole lot of other invisible people. The profession is full of invisible people, men and women, and that when you start looking for women, you have to change the parameters of what you're looking for and what you're valuing. So, which is not to say there haven't been women doing amazing work, but it's it's not simply a matter of sort of digging up some unknown women. It's a bit of both, but it's about shifting what's valued, how it's valued. One of the problems with Wikipedia is the notability criteria are quite strict, and for architecture they're based on art and this assumption of a sort of singular creative genius. Of course we know that buildings are made through teams, architects work in teams. It's the role of those people is not always recorded, so it goes back to the way we represent, the way we publish, the way we talk about. When I was at Architecture Australia, I spent half my time changing the name of the architect into the name of the practice, putting the word architects on the end, because that work is done by that group. And architects themselves will struggle with this because everyone wants to identify the author, and it's just not that straightforward.
Cameron, can you speak to that too?
I just want to pay tribute to Justine here in some respects, but this idea of what gets recorded is a really significant one. And I would just talk about one of the very practical ways in which any Australian or any practice of architectural practice worldwide can do something very simple to make sure that we do have more people recorded in terms of the overall participation that goes into making a building. And Justine, in her time at Architecture Australia, was strident in asking architectural practices. That was the polite version. And making sure that architectural practices of all scales and types took the time to accurately provide project team lists to be published in Architecture Australia to record who worked on a project. Now, of course, much of this is pre-internet, so for many of those projects, the pages of Architecture Australia, what is printed on those pages in terms of team lists, is a very particular and hopefully rather accurate historical record of who worked on a project. So I would encourage, of course, all practices to make sure that when they are having a project published, when they have the opportunity to see a project presented to the public, that everyone who's worked on it in some arrangement is recorded, because that is one way of writing a type of architectural history about who worked on a project. Now, in the new world of architectural publishing, where events are as important as magazines, those lists take on a whole other identity, because when we're constructing events or talk series, we mine those lists. Okay, we know that the person whose name on the door is a man, but we don't want that person. We want the person who was the project architect who did the work to talk about it. And often the only real way of identifying who that person is to go back to that list and go, okay, project director, so-and-so, that's great. Who was the project architect, or who was the senior leader? And those lists can be invaluable in terms of providing access to another type of architectural record.
So you'll actively sort of look for those other names, or those, the people that haven't had a voice or been profiled to date when you're programming?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is about the nature of programming. I think there's, and we've already talked about that kind of fascination that architecture and architectural culture has with the singular named identity. And back to Camilla, that tends to be a male identity. One of the things that I've tried to do, and we've kind of been working on over the last few years, is to change the formats of our presentations, of our conferences, of our speaker programs, so that it's not all assuming that everyone in the profession would like to get up and spend 45 minutes or an hour talking about their work. To find ways of cutting it back, to say, okay, Ingrid, that's a great project that you led. Would you talk about that one project for 15 minutes? Now, it's not so daunting, Instead of being asked to get up in front of your peers and talk for an hour about your work and to hold the audience, cut it back into a smaller piece where someone will feel that they have the permission to say, actually, okay, they're not asking the project director, they're asking me to talk specifically for 10 minutes about that piece of work. And that has, in combination with those lists, been very effective for us at diversifying the type of people who might speak at our events.
And it's also about building people's experience. Like, very few people are fantastic public speakers straight off, but they're not going to. And one of the things you always hear is, oh, we asked a woman, but she didn't want to because she wasn't feeling confident, or, she recommended someone else, whatever. And it's just one of those things with, it's kind of a furphy in some ways, and in some ways, people do give those answers, but we need to find a whole lot of ways of giving people experience at these different levels, different kinds of speaking. A panel is a very different experience than a 40-minute lecture. It's also about what you've got time to prepare. We can say yes to a panel because we can just rock up and talk off the top of our heads. We can't. If someone asks me to give a 40-minute lecture, I'm like, well, you're either going to have the one I've given before, or you're going to have to pay me a lot of money. But I think these.
Sorry, no, keep going. Keep going.
I've talked for 40 minutes.
Can I just bring an academic perspective? Because I feel like it's, doesn't matter why. One of the things about developing the XYX lab that we spoke about, and it's kind of, I can't think of how this would relate to practice, but I think it's interesting nonetheless, is one of we were struggling with women in our faculty, like most architecture faculties. And aside from...
You were really bad.
Yeah, we were really bad. And aside from saying that, there's this stuff around equity is happening, it's important, let's pay attention to what's happening in the community. The other thing that I kind of claimed is that if you want women to come and work here, you've got to actually do research that women are interested in producing. So, lots of women wanted to come and be part of thinking about gender and cities, not... I shouldn't say the other things that we're researching, but so I think that you have to kind of think about what women kind of want to participate in as well. And so it's not just head on a stick at a panel or head on a stick talking about the work that, you know, has predominantly been commissioned and produced by a particular gender, but we really need to think more carefully about the kinds of projects we want to make, which is a little bit about we want to kind of be interested in diversity. And so what does that mean when we're actually designing projects?
Just on that, I don't think we're going to have a choice going forward. The thing that I've been super encouraged with, particularly in our practice, but I'm seeing it in others as well, is that particularly the younger women are just going, well, come on, let's just fix this, let's sort it out. And they're starting to self-organise and propel. There's going to be a whole lot of initiatives that just start to happen within the practice because they're doing it. There's lots of them in this audience who I'm just super proud of. They're just amazing, amazing women. And they're doing it because enough's enough. You know, the time has come to just sort this shit out. And, you know, that's the reality. So I think we're going to have, you know, you're going to have to make sure it's interesting because they're going to be saying, we're not doing it unless it's bloody interesting. You know, there's going to be this kind of real drive from the next generation, I think. You know, I talk about this gender balance stuff with my teenage boys and they're going, what are you talking about, Mum? Like, what is it? What, you know, and I start telling them about some of the things that happened back in the 80s and they're just going, you're kidding. Like, really? Seriously? That actually happened? Like, they just can't comprehend it. So I think this groundswell is going to help a lot. I'm not saying it's solving everything, Justine. I'm looking at you.
Well, one of the things that I was really Parlour surprised me in lots of ways, but one of the things was talking to young women and then telling me the stories of how their peers treated them, and I was really shocked because I had assumed that, you know, those 18, 19, 20-year-olds at the university were, you know, wouldn't behave like that anymore. So, but good.
But also,
we need to have, you know, bring up fabulous young men.
It's one thing to kind of see change within the profession and to be acknowledging what that means for architects in the profession, but we actually design cities for people. And just because you've got gender equity in your practices or, you know, a leader in your practice, the fact is that the world is incredibly difficult for women and girls and for the LGBTI community and all different kinds of issues that we're having around inequity. And so that needs to then follow through into the way we practice, into the methods that we use to understand the buildings and cities we're making. So I think that for me kind of is where this needs to kind of head as well.
Nicole, in your book, I think you talk about the dangers of post-feminism. Could you maybe talk a bit about that in relation to some of what we're talking about now?
I guess an example that I could give you that is related to the conversation that we're having and this idea of perhaps safety and women's experiences in cities is I write a lot in the book about hypersexual images of women and about kind of the soft core cities that we find ourselves in. And one of the things that we're discovering from actually working with young women and girls is that, you know, I kind of thought maybe this was my academic thing that perhaps didn't land very neatly in the world, but indeed it does. And so we know that when women and girls are kind of triangulated with highly sexualised images of women, that there's this thing that happens where, you know, the city shapes us and we shape the city. So, you know, some men come to expect women to behave in some particular ways, and that might relate to the ways that women are being sexually harassed on streets because they might be kind of you know, triangulated with these images of very, very sexualised kind of images of women in advertising and things. The other thing I kind of talk about is kind of sex districts and strip club districts, which happen in all areas of the city. And with the free-to-be map, what we noticed is that no one put pins on King Street because actually women have already self-excluded from King Street, unless, of course, you're a sex worker. But, you know, that we're already kind of modifying our behaviour around particular areas of the city. So I'm just kind of interested in thinking about what those things mean and yes, I kind of, in doing so, I'm questioning the idea that we are able just to freely be whatever we want to be, because indeed there are consequences for all of us when we think about very hypersexualised images, and we perhaps need to think more carefully about what those consequences are for all women, not just for ourselves.
And also, I guess, for the LGBTI community as well, or thinking about how much more difficult it must be in that context too.
So with the public transport issues, we actually know that most trans people, for example, cannot get a train without, risk of death. So, and that's a very particular thing which is different to a young girl's experience, which is different to, other experiences. We also know that if you're a young woman and you have a particular ethnic background, then your chance of being sexually harassed or assaulted is actually increased. So these things are very nuanced and we need to understand them in much greater detail.
Ingrid, with the work that you do with the kind of rallying sort of self-initiated by the young women, are you seeing a trickle-up effect into management?
Yeah, totally. As I said before, I think there's always been a kind of acknowledgement and want to create, a very inclusive and diverse workforce within the business, but not necessarily an understanding of how to do that. And I think then what's happening is the girls are just starting to do stuff. And that's now starting to show the management or upper senior levels of the business, that there's all these other things that can happen and that there's all these other voices. And so I think over time it's just going to, it'll be right through the business. I think there is some, women in leadership, like myself, but there's not many of us. So I think part of what I'm really interested in seeing happen is this groundswell, and then hopefully they stay within the business and become owners of the business and run the place.
Succession plans?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. No, there's a lot of work being done around succession and fast-tracking people, really identifying people with great leadership skills regardless of their kind of levels of experience, because some people are great leaders even though they might only be 2 years out of uni, So really having a look at, rather than just going, well, you've got to do at least 10 years before you become a, whatever. We don't think about it like that. It's about what skills people can bring to the practice, regardless of sort of their background or their gender or their level of experience even.
Okay, we might wrap up there. All about balance. Please say thank you to my wonderful panellists.